Witchwater by Phylis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 2. Have you seen Mrs. Tuggle's cat? Mrs. Morley sliced Lynn's cream cheese and raisin sandwich in half, stuck it in a plastic bag, and placed it in her lunch sack. She had her jacket on and was ready to leave for the studio, but she always waited till her 3 children were off to school. Lynn licked the cinnamon off her toast and watched her mother. Yes, she said finally. I saw it when Mouse and I took the muffins up. Isn't it huge? It looks like a Persian. It comes to the studio sometimes in the morning if the air is cold and I have the stove going. It likes to stretch out on the floor when it's warm. Cats don't live very exciting lives, do they? This time Lynn didn't answer. She ran her finger over the plate to get the last of the sugar, finished her orange juice, winced at the sour taste, and went up to brush her teeth. A blast of rock music trailed past the bathroom door, and on downstairs as Judith and her transistor radio went by. They then sounded again as Judith came back up. Lynn, she said from the doorway, can't you do anything about Marjorie? I saw her in the drugstore the other day, and it looked like she was wearing one of her father's shirts and not much else. I mean, she doesn't actually go to school dressed like that, does she? Lynn sloshed the water around in her mouth and spit it out. The first week, Mouse had come to school one day in her pajama tops and jeans. And once during the second week, she had worn a jogging outfit. But Lynn couldn't remember Marjorie wearing her father's shirts in school. Socks, maybe, but not shirts. I don't understand why you get upset about it, Lynn said. She's not in your school. You don't have to look at her. Just thinking about her makes me upset, Judith said. I keep thinking how everyone's going to laugh and make fun of her when she gets to junior high. And if you can't get her to take better care of herself, it's hopeless. I mean, now that her mother's in Ohio, we've got to sort of look out for her, you know? Sure, Lynn said, wondering. Good. The music grew fainter as Judith went downstairs again, and this time she went out and shut the door. Lynn looked in the mirror and tried pinning her ponytail on top of her head, but it fell down on each side around her ears, so she gave up. She wished she had Judith's long black hair and Judith's large brown eyes set in that china doll face. So Judith was actually concerned about Mouse, self-centered old Judith. Maybe she really was maturing after all, like Mother said she would once she reached the 9th grade. When Lynn went downstairs, Mrs. Morley was pinning a piece of paper to Stevie's shirt, with his name and address in large print. How long does he have to wear that? Lynn asked. This is the last day, school requirements. Too many kindergarten children take the wrong turn and end up lost, so they have to wear address tags for the first 3 weeks. Well, it's dumb, said Stevie disgustedly. Mrs. Morley kissed him. I want you back safe and sound, she said. Come on, and I'll walk as far as the corner with you. Have a good day, Stevie, Lynn said. I'll be along later. I'm waiting for Mouse. When the door closed the second time, Lynn went upstairs to get her gym clothes ready. Her room was on the 3rd floor. In fact, it was the 3rd floor, hers and Judith's. A heavy curtain in the middle separated one girl's territory from the others. Lynn folded her gym suit and socks into a neat bundle and then put them in her school bag along with her lunch and sweater. She could hear Mother singing outside on the sidewalk, and occasionally Stevie's little voice chimed in. The Morley household was cheerful and relaxed when Mother was working on the 2nd draft of a book. Even better, however, when she was writing the 3rd. The first was the most difficult, she always said. It was the skeleton of the story, the laborious fitting together of all the bones on paper. It was long and tedious, and it was during this period that Lynn could never understand why Mother wanted to write in the first place, for it made her cross and irritable. The 2nd draft was the flesh and blood, Mother said, and took only half as long to do. The plot would begin to shape up, the characters to stir, the suspense to build, and Mrs. Morley's spirits rose along with it. This was where Mother was now. It was during 3rd drafts, however, that Lynn realized what writing meant to her mother and why she would never be happy doing anything else. The 3rd draft was the soul, and the whole story came alive. Happy birthday, Sylvia, Dad had scribbled once on a card that went with her present. May all your birthdays be 3rd drafts. Glancing out the window, she saw Mouse coming up the street. She threw her school bag over her shoulder, clattering downstairs to 2nd, another flight to the landing, and another flight to 1st. Closing the door behind her, she went down the steps to the walk, then down a steeper flight to the main sidewalk where Mouse was waiting. This time, Marjorie's clothes were even worse than Judith could have imagined. She had on an old paint-stained sweater shirt over a pair of Bermuda shorts. As usual, her socks didn't match, and one sneaker had no laces at all. Lynn thought about it as they walked up the hill and made the turn. There was something more to all this than casualness. It seemed like a deliberate attempt to look awful. Mouse had never cared very much about clothes, it was true, but since her mother had moved away, Mouse's appearance had gone from bad to worse. Sort of chilly for shorts, isn't it? Lynn commented finally. Mouse shrugged. Sun's hot. It'll be warm later. Listen, Lynn. I think I understand about Mrs. Tuggle's cat. It's her familiar. Her familiar? What kind of English is that? You mean it looks familiar? No, I mean it is her familiar. All witches have one. I was reading about it last night. It's a demon that stays around a witch to help her out, and it's usually in the form of an animal, like a goat or cat or bird or lizard. What book were you reading? Spells and Potions, that rare book that Daddy bought from his shop. Lynn thought this over. Mrs. Tuggle says that the cat just came to her one night, scratched at the door, and she let it in. More likely she conjured it up, Mouse said. It could even be the soul of a dead person, bodily transfigured into the form of a cat. Witches can do that too, you know. They reached the school and jostled their way through the groups of students in the hall till they came to their room at the end. Two girls standing by the window stared at Mouse, then turned away giggling. Lynn pretended she hadn't noticed, but inside she was hurting for her friend. Mouse slid into her seat and slouched down till her feet were under the seat in front of her. A boy in the next row reached over and tapped her on the shoulder. Hey, where's your paint bucket? He teased. Mouse didn't answer. She pulled up the big glasses that always slid down her nose, took out her geography book, and seemed absorbed in the first chapter. But Lynn, watching from across the room, knew that Mouse wasn't reading at all, and in spite of acting so cool and nonchalant, she knew that Mouse was miserable. Was it possible, Lynn wondered, that Marjorie felt her mother didn't care for her, which probably wasn't true at all, and if her own mother didn't care, then how could anyone else? And if nobody cared, why should she care about herself? In fact, if she looked awful enough, maybe somebody would pay attention. Lynn had known Mouse for a long time. Nobody had ever been such a good friend. Marjorie had always been there to help when Lynn needed her, and now that Mouse needed somebody, Lynn wanted to help, but she wasn't sure how. As usual, when the girls had something on their minds, they talked it over at their secret place in the old cemetery. When school let out at 3, they walked back to Water Street, crossed over, and made their way down the steep hill to the creek, then up the bank on the other side until they reached the spiked fence. The high iron gate that had long since rusted open swung creakily on its upper hinge. Tall grass grew up around the gravestones, and the entire place was completely silent except for the rustle of wind in the branches above. Somewhere, down by Cowden's Creek, one crow cawed, then another. Lynn and Marjorie walked slowly, parting the high grass as they walked, till they came to the half-dead oak tree. There, the tombstone of Mrs. Elfrida Lewis had long since fallen down in front of the tombstone of Mr. Lewis, making a perfect high-backed chair. This was Lynn's seat. Mouse sat across from her on the marble scroll held between two angels, the grave of C.L. Pritchard, and draped an arm around each angel's neck. Her eyebrows frowned behind the big circles of her glasses. Finally, she said, I think Mrs. Tuggle is trying to form a coven of witches, like the book said. Each additional witch raises the cone of power. The more girls she can get, the more she can do. She chooses them one at a time. And one of us is next, Mouse. I know it, Lynn added. All last summer she tried to get Judith. Then Judith got sick and lost interest in going to Mrs. Tuggle's house anymore. In fact, she almost lost her memory. She hardly ever talks about her now, and she used to go up there every night. They were quiet a moment, trying to fit the pieces together. If we ever gave in, Lynn, Mouse said finally, I mean, if we ever went to her house and let her teach us witchcraft, we would never be the same again, I'm sure of it. Lynn paled. Mouse was the authority on witches, and she must know what she was talking about. If she only knew how close Lynn had come to having her feelings swept away. In spite of all her fears and distrust and horror of Mrs. Tuggle, in spite of the sense of evil, there was also a deep curiosity inside herself. And this, she saw now, was the most dangerous thing of all. What would it be like to be involved in witchcraft? To have that power over people and the things that happened to them? The attraction was there, whether she liked it or not, and it might draw her in against her will. How would we be different, Mouse? We wouldn't have control over ourselves any longer. We would be in the power of witchcraft. We might not even be friends. Not like we are now, anyway. All that would matter to us would be Mrs. Tuggle and what she wanted us to do. Glory, Mouse! How can we be sure we're not trapped already? Because Daddy's rare book said that before you can be drawn into witchcraft, you have to want it more than anything else at some particular moment. As long as you always want something else more, it can't take you. As long as we want to be friends more than we want to be witches, she can't hurt us. Still, Lynn had doubts. But what if, just for a tiny fraction of a minute, we were just sort of overcome with curiosity? I don't know, Mouse looked grave. If Mrs. Tuggle wasn't around, I suppose we'd be okay. But if we felt that way for even a fraction of a minute when she was using her full power on us, then nothing could save us. The air was so still that Lynn could hear herself breathing. Did she dare trust herself to go to Mrs. Tuggle's again? And what about Mouse? Marjorie was the one who was the most suggestible. She took a deep breath. So, Mrs. Tuggle, for some reason, wants to build up a coven. Is that all a witch has to do to get her full powers? No, Mouse said. There's something else. Maybe she's already done it. What? Murder a younger brother or sister. Lynn stared at Mouse. C.L. Pritchard. Who else? Mouse unwrapped her arms from around the angels' necks and tapped thoughtfully on the tombstone beneath her. How long would it take to dig up a grave, Lynn? That's out. The body's been buried, Mouse, for 40 years. How could we prove he'd been murdered? And besides, there's a law against it. You'd have to have a court order. You have to have a court order for everything. Again, they were silent. The cemetery was a good talking place because they were alone, and yet Lynn often had the feeling that someone else was around. It was as though the tall trees themselves were listening. Oh, Mouse, she said suddenly. What? If I did fall under Mrs. Tuggle's spell, and if she did make me a witch, and I wanted to obtain my full powers. They stared at each other. That's right, Mouse whispered. You would have to murder Stevie. Lynn gulped. She couldn't get me, she declared finally. She couldn't. I just would never let it happen, she sat thinking, and then turned slowly to her friend. Mouse, how strong are you? 78 pounds. No, I mean, psychologically, if Mrs. Tuggle were to use all her powers, could you hold out against her? I'd buckle right under, Lynn, beginning at the knees. That's what I was afraid of. Then we've got to keep you away from her. If you don't have anything to do with her at all, I don't see how she can hurt you. But I've got to find out more somehow. There must be evidence around if we just knew where to look. Marjorie's eyes were still frowning. So if she murdered her brother 40 years ago to become a full-power witch, what's she been doing all this time? How come she's just now getting around to form a coven? I've wondered about that too. Of course, we don't know exactly what she's been doing all these years. Maybe she's been working on it all along. Suddenly, Mouse sat up. Lynn? When did she first ask Judith to come over and sew? Sometime last winter, February maybe. And when did the town first start talking about digging up the old cemetery? Good grief, Mouse, how should I know? Lynn thought for a moment. Didn't it first make the newspaper after the town meeting in January? Right. So, there's some reason she doesn't want anyone to dig up the old cemetery. Maybe she needs all the power she can get to stop it. Mouse, you're brilliant. You really are. Lynn stared at her admiringly, and suddenly she thought it was the appropriate time to add something else. Now, if you just looked brilliant, you'd really be something. Look, Mouse, do me a favor and don't wear that sweatshirt to school again. Marjorie seemed a little embarrassed. Heck, I don't care how I look, she said. I care about you, Mouse, Lynn said earnestly. Mouse stood up and dug the toe of her sneaker in the grass. If it embarrasses you to be seen with me, it's not that, Mouse. If it made you happy, I wouldn't care, but I don't think it does. If it really made you happy, I wouldn't care if you came to school naked. And then, because she wasn't too sure what Mouse would do next, she said, Erase, erase, I didn't mean it, but I do care, Mouse. Really, because I like you more than anyone else. They both stared down the hill at the creek again, which separated them from the hill on the other side, the meadow and the houses up along the rim. It was odd, but there seemed to be something different about the water in the creek as it passed behind Mrs. Tuggle's house. Lynn had noticed it before, but it made little impression on her until now. Cowden's Creek was wide, 4 feet deep in places, and good for swimming. For the most part, it flowed slowly in a lazy kind of current. If you dropped a stick in the water near the cemetery, it took forever, it seemed, to get down to the business district. But the part of the creek that ran behind Mrs. Tuggle's meadow was different. Here the water was deepest. It seemed to flow in several directions at once, perhaps because of the huge rocks that dotted the creek bottom. But there was something more. Sometimes, when Lynn looked down in the water here, it was as though her reflection were changing, and the little whirlpools that appeared here and there were sucking in her very soul. There were even certain times of the year when a sort of steaming mist seemed to rise up from this part of the creek and nowhere else. Lynn started to tell Mouse about it when all at once she felt a tug on her arm, and then she was yanked down hard in the tall grass. Mouse crouched beside her, one finger to her lips. From somewhere on the other side of the bank came the soft, crackling sound of footsteps in the underbrush, and when Lynn raised her head and peered through the weeks, she could make out Mrs. Tuggle on the opposite side, walking with her back toward them. But it wasn't just the crunch of grass that broke the stillness. From the trees overhead came the loud cawing of crows, cackling in concert. The girls waited. The old woman stopped and stretched her arms. Bath him, Parsan, Abagar, she chanted. Shadar, Asmon, Lorve, Valafar, Marbos, Proslos. Instantly the crows came flying down, 9 in all, and landed on Mrs. Tuggle's outstretched arms. Mouse! Lynn whispered in terror. Marjorie was shaking so violently that her arms vibrated against Lynn's. Mrs. Tuggle's gray hair, usually done up in a tight bun, hung loose around her shoulders and blew in thin wisps as the wind caught it. Soft, animal-like noises came from her throat, cooing sounds, guttural grunts, as she talked first to the birds on her left and then on her right. All at once she lifted her arms quickly toward the sky, and the crows flew off, cawing loudly, and roosted in the tall sycamore there on the bank. Mrs. Tuggle took a few steps toward her house on the hill, then stopped. She stood absolutely motionless, like a fox sniffing the air. Then suddenly she turned and looked directly at the place where the girls were hiding, smiled, and went on up the hill. "Oh, Lordy, Lynn, did she see us?" Mouse bleated, and her voice shook with every syllable. "Did she know we were here?" "She always knows," said Lynn. They got up, walking along the creek in the other direction, till they came to the swinging footbridge that connected both banks and crossed over. "I'm not going home," Mouse said suddenly. "If anything jumped out at me, a cricket even, I'd faint. I'm going to walk into town and stay at Daddy's store till he closes." She followed the creek on down toward the business district, and Lynn went up through the meadow to her house, her heart still pounding. When she reached Mother's garden, she paused for just a moment and looked back. Mouse was growing smaller and smaller as she tramped through the weeds by the creek. She looked so tiny and weak and vulnerable, somehow dwarfed by the tall trees that rose up here and there along the bank. And then Lynn's heart almost stopped beating, for 9 black crows were moving swiftly from one treetop to the next, following Mouse. As the days went on, it became clear to Lynn just whom it was that Mrs. Tuggle was after, for the crows followed Marjorie wherever she went. They did not come down and fly about her head, making it obvious. In fact, Mouse herself had not noticed, but they were always there in a tree nearby, and there were always 9. Marjorie was the weaker of the 2 girls, and Mrs. Tuggle knew it. The old woman had made her choice. For 5 days, Lynn said nothing, not even to Mouse. Marjorie had enough problems without worrying about 9 black shadows overhead who were always watching, always waiting, but Lynn observed how they followed Mouse to school each day and home again, quiet, seldom cawing or attracting attention to themselves. And whenever she counted, the number was always the same: 9. What did it mean? Lynn decided to hold a conference with herself. She had done it once when she was getting along well with a teacher at school and felt she'd been treated unfairly. She did it another time when she decided she was wasting her allowance. Now it was time for still another conference, and this one, she knew, was the most serious of all because it involved her best friend. On a Thursday afternoon, when Mother and Stevie had gone to the post office, Lynn went up to her bedroom on the 3rd floor and lay down, staring up at the slanted ceiling. She tried to think of nothing at all, to rid her mind of clutter. She liked to think of herself during these sessions as both the psychiatrist and the patient, and proceeded to ask herself questions out loud. It was essential that she be absolutely honest in her answer. How long have you felt that Mrs. Tuggle was a witch? Since spring, after Judith had been going to her house for several months and began acting strangely. What proof did you really find that they were practicing witchcraft? None. Just a lot of things going on that seemed strange, that hadn't happened before. But Mom and Dad called them coincidences. And now that Judith isn't going to Mrs. Tuggle's anymore and seems to have forgotten the whole thing, why can't you let it drop? Because I'm afraid for Mouse. There must be more to it than that. Mouse could stay away from her if she's so scared. You know that if you stayed away, Mouse would too. You're the one who dragged her up there the other night. But the crows. Isn't it true that you're really very curious about Mrs. Tuggle? And even if the crows stopped following Marjorie, you'd still want to find out? Yes, I suppose I would. There's something about her that draws me to her and scares me, and that scares me. I'm afraid to go without somebody along. Then you're more eager to satisfy your curiosity than you are to protect Mouse. That's the way it seems, doesn't it? Okay, I'll never take Mouse up there again. It's not your worry anyway. If Mrs. Tuggle really is a witch, it will come out eventually, and the adults will take care of it. But if I can't get her out of my mind, I have this terrible feeling of evil. But I can't get her out of my mind. I have this terrible feeling of evil when I'm near her, and it's impossible to stay away completely, with Mother renting her hen house and asking me to run errands and things. A feeling of evil is not exactly proof of evil. She's kept to herself for a long time and is bound to seem strange. If you help spread rumors about her, you make it hard for anybody to see her as anything other than a witch. I know that, and sometimes I worry about it, but I don't think I'm the kind of person who spreads rumors. One time in school, everybody thought Jonathan Kelly was stealing things from people's desks. I never even liked him, but I said we shouldn't be talking about him till somebody had proof, and when it turned out that it really was somebody else, I was glad for Jonathan. But isn't there a little bit of excitement in all this for you? Maybe you don't really want to hurt Mrs. Tuggle or ruin her reputation, but you enjoy the suspense. At first, I think that was true. When the feeling started last spring, it was just a suspicion that grew, a hunch. But now,